Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dr. Becky Aiken, and I'm here with my colleague and friend and co-host. I'm just going to keep adding on words to his title, Galen Clavio. And this is a big episode. Galen, do you know why this is a big episode?
I don't. Why is it a big episode?
It's number 10.
Oh, hey, I love round numbers just like you do.
Right. We made it to 10 episodes. I was going to do the research before we hopped on. It's a very small number of podcasts that actually end up doing more than like 3 episodes.
I
S- So I feel good about it because if you see the stats, there's so many podcasts out there.
yeah.
But when I write marketing plans, I'm always looking for podcasts for clients to try to guest on. And so when you really dig in, so many podcasts did 1 or 2 or 5 episodes and never existed again.
Yeah, there's a vast podcast graveyard out there. And I'm even responsible for a few of those. Now, most of mine have gotten past 10, but there's some that like I've had co-hosts who can't do them anymore, or timetables worked out, or the show just kind of ran its course. I do have one podcast, my main one, that what did we hit 1178 episodes yesterday, and it's so I'm proud of that, and I feel like we should get some kind of a bonus from somebody for keeping it alive that long.
Isn't that the beauty though? Where does the bonus come from? Just your own internal
Yeah,
satisfaction.
that's really it's the big. There's no great podcast bonus giver in the sky, unfortunately. You're just kind of having to go off of your own recognizance. At least we're getting audience now. It only took 14 years, but the audience is really flowing in, which is that's in and of itself a nice reward.
I kind of look at it a little bit like publishing, like perseverance
Hmm.
is really important. That my number one thing my advisor told me, if you want to publish research, is you have got to persevere and keep trying and keep trying. So I think the same thing might be true for podcasting.
Yeah, no, totally. Look, I always tell people, when I first started podcasting, it was 2007, and I didn't start the main podcast that I still do until 2009. And no one listened for the longest time, except the people that were on the podcast, and maybe like your mom, that you were like, she was like, "Oh, that's nice, honey," and, it wasn't actually listening, and it really it does take audience doesn't just arrive. Audience has to be built. Even big podcasts, audience has to be built. And so much of it, and I tell my students this all the time, is just do the show. Do the show again, get a pattern going. It has to be something you want to do. And if it's not, then it's not going to survive regardless of how many audience you get. And so that's, I think, probably the biggest take home point with all of this is like it like everything else, it just takes a while for you to get into the rhythm of things. And once you do it and you're comfortable with it, you'll wonder how it took you so long to get there. But it's all part of the process.
Well, I'm excited to have made it to 10 episodes. And this week's episode, or this episode, not week, but this episode is going to be about why you might want to use guest speakers and when they might be a good fit for your class, especially as we're, at the beginning of the semester. And this is an opportunity or a time where you might be trying to nail some of those people down to get them in your classroom, either virtually or in person. One of the greatest things to come from COVID is the ability to bring guest speakers in from almost anywhere. We could do that before, but it just wasn't secondhand to us. Now, hopping on Zoom for a class to get a guest speaker from, across the world, that's not that big of a deal or that big of a lift. And so there's a lot more opportunity now than there might have been in the past to have guest speakers with expertise come into your classrooms. Now, I have to tell you, I started my teaching career as a anti-guest speaker person. In fact,
Okay.
I actively tried not to have guest speakers. And I think part of that was interactions I had early on as a PhD student, where the perspective was from others in my department, as well as students that I was going to school with, it was lazy, right? We had one professor in my PhD program. I'm not kidding. Every week was a guest speaker, and we weren't exactly sure what his job was because the guest speakers did all of the work.
Yeah.
And I think that just kind of soured me on it. And so I was like, I am the expert. I don't need the guest speaker. And I have evolved significantly since then. I don't know if I can really say why. I think a lot of it came from, recognizing that in sport management specifically, where I taught before my job now, we are often asked to be knowledgeable a lot about a lot of fields. So like I was teaching sport events, sport marketing really was my area of expertise, but I was teaching sport finance
Yeah.
and sport law. And that's a very diverse field. There's a big difference between getting a PhD in molecular biology, I can't even say it, and sport management for your focus. And what you're asked to do when you become a teacher. So I recognize that a sport law course was going to be made much better with people who had expertise, who were exactly lawyers and could speak to what was happening in the industry. But then as I became really engaged as a professional myself, I recognized, sure, I knew a lot, but boy, I didn't know it all. And how beneficial could it be for students to hear from other people and most often, hear similar things, but just from somebody working in it. I don't know if you ever had a different feeling about guest speakers or what your kind of thoughts are on guest speakers.
I mean, I think it's very context dependent. And like you, having, first taught in sports management and then into sports media, you're sometimes you're teaching a class like, organizational behavior. Like I'm probably not the best person to talk to about that. Or marketing. I was a communications person. Now I understand the concepts, I can talk through the concepts, but I think especially in more applied fields like what we've taught in the sports realm, it's helpful to have a voice now and then that's not you, and especially a voice that can lend a lot of credence and authority to what you're trying to get across to people. I i look at it though from this perspective. I've gotten to the point with a lot of the classes that I've designed and taught where I prefer not to bring in guest speakers, not because I don't think the guest speakers wouldn't be a good group to hear from, but more because I know how I want to approach each topic, and I know how I want to communicate certain things. I know what examples I want, and I believe that those have the best educational outcomes. But I think again, it's very dependent on the class you're teaching. So I taught a World Cup class in fall of 2022, and it was about the setup of the tournament, the cultural and societal implications, and the business implications, and everything like that. And I had a ton of guest speakers. I had the lead play-by-play broadcaster for Fox for soccer came in and zoomed in and talked. I had the guy who had been the PR head for USA men's soccer for many years. He talked. We had an alum who was the head of media relations for MLS came in and talked. I mean, so those sorts of circumstances, I think it's really important. And then I do think in very applied courses, it's sometimes it just adds so much more if you've got professionals. So I'll use, like, we have a one of our sports broadcasting courses is taught by one of our now full-time faculty, but she was an adjunct for a long time, and she's got so many contacts in the industry. So she's got the Apple TV play-by-play person zooming in, and she's got the sideline reporter for the New York Yankees zooming in. And these are all people she's friendly with and that she works with, and she does a great job of setting it up where the students are learning directly from these folks. They come in with questions. They have a 20 or 30-minute question and answer session. When it's done properly, when you properly prepare the students, when you bring the right people in, it can add layers and dimensions that you could never get just by doing it yourself. I think gets, a lot of the stigma around using guest speakers has been when it's clearly just, I'm not going to prepare anything or tell you anything about the guest speaker, or they may not even have a great tie to specifically what we're supposed to be talking about, but they're just going to talk today. That is the kind of thing I've tried to avoid.
And I think along with that, that's one of the downfalls, right? Is trying to avoid just bringing someone in because you want a day off, I guess, is the
Yes.
easiest way to say that. But also, if you don't vet someone at least a little bit, it can be risky to bring in a guest speaker for a couple things that you said, Galen, which is you often have you not often you have an idea of about the topic and what you want students to take away and the examples you want to use. And this has happened to me before where I brought in a guest speaker. We had an initial conversation. I thought they were going to be great. And they literally said the opposite of everything I would ever want students to do or think. And some of it was like borderline not ethical.
Yeah.
And it was like, "Oh, no, now" and for a couple reasons. One, because they heard it from a professional, so they're more likely to trust what they say than what I say.
Right.
And two, a little bit of that transfers, right? So if that person says it in my class, students will say, "Well, in Dr. Aiken's class, I heard, but Dr. Aiken does not feel that way." But I don't have an opportunity to say that I don't feel that way. And you can debrief guest speakers to work through some of those challenges. But one thing you want to be careful about is at least if this is a new person you don't know, and I reach out randomly on LinkedIn all the time to ask for guest speakers, I find most professionals like to give back and are excited about that as an opportunity. But if I don't know them at all, we will have an initial phone conversation to talk through the class, the what the topic is, what they think about the topic, just to hear them speak so that it's not we get up there and it's a monotone
Right.
hour long, no back and forth. And I think that's really, really important to do to try to avoid that. But you really, I mean, obviously, the more you know someone, the easier it is to bring them in. But definitely, you want to do some due diligence in vetting those guest speakers and also be prepared to be taking notes about things that you might need to revisit after the guest speaker has gone. And that might not be that same day, it might be the next class period where you circle back to it. But you definitely always have to be prepared for that because those are 2 potential downfalls of the guest speaker
Yeah.
tactic.
Yeah. I have, over the course of my time in academia and with my contacts in industry, I've built up a pretty big Rolodex of people that I'm comfortable with having come in and talk to my class as guest speakers, either Zoom or in person. And I've winnowed it down to where I don't have that many people that I really feel comfortable talking to the class because of what you just said. Like I had a guest speaker recently who I just thought was kind of a dud. I mean, just didn't really bring a lot to the table. They had great credentials, but they really they struggled with maintaining a conversational tone and those sorts of things. And so I didn't feel like the students got as much out of it as they could have. But yeah, you really do need to have a pretty good sense of what the guest speaker is going to say. Now, this kind of leads to I think an interesting question, and it's part of what you wanted to talk about here anyway. So I'm going to jump ahead just slightly, but I'm curious how you handle guest speakers, because what I generally do, I hate it when someone's like, "Here's our guest speaker," and then they have the guest speaker talk for 20 minutes or whatever, and then they open it up to questions, because students oftentimes struggle to ask good questions or the right questions. So I almost act like I'm Zach Galifianakis. Like I'm going to interview the guest speaker and try to guide the conversation into the areas I want them to talk to. And that will oftentimes lead to students asking better questions, I think, because now I've framed it and framed what they're hearing and framed what the guest speaker is talking about. And that'll generally lead to a better repartee between the class and the people or the person that's doing the talking. Not everybody likes that. Some people think, oh, the professor's getting in the way of the guest speaker or whatever. But to me, it's like a lot of times when as the instructor what you want to come across in the class, that's a better way of going about it than just throwing the dice and hoping.
90% of the time, I'm just like you. I am a interviewer and I send them a list of questions prior to our class. I give them an opportunity to say, I can't really talk about this. These look good. And then I use that to guide the conversation. Sometimes we go down a rabbit hole if they say something else, and that's fine. And I usually stop, 3 or 4 questions in and ask if students have any questions and give them multiple opportunities throughout the question and answer piece. So oftentimes there's never a formal like end question and answer session. It's me inviting the students in. If they don't have any, I make the same joke every time like, I could ask questions forever because I could. I've usually got a list of 20 questions that I could ask. I never ask them all. And that way, like you said, it is a little bit more dynamic. Most of the time, guest speakers giving a presentation for 30 or 45 minutes doesn't tend to go very well for student attention standpoint. And, one of the things you want to avoid is having students look like they don't want the person to be there, because it's very hard to get them to either come back or to tell somebody else to come to your class if the students look like they're not engaged. So I'm like you, I definitely prepare. And one other way to give students some time to think through questions is to require them to submit them on your LMS system before class. And that way you can even pull some of their questions out, because you're always going to have those students will not raise their hand. They
Yep.
just will not, but they often have great questions. And so sometimes I'll even put those in as like in my back pocket questions to use as well, so that they get asked, but the student doesn't feel the pressure to talk in front of the group or to talk to that professional. Sometimes that power imbalance is a little anxiety provoking, especially if they're a really accomplished professional. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, like you, I very rarely, the only exception to that is if there's somebody that I have had talk in multiple classes, I will give them the option. I'll say, do you have something you want to present? And if I know they're a dynamic speaker, great. I've got like 3 or 4 people that I've ever had do that, and they are national speakers. They go on the speaker circuit at conferences. So they're quite a different, type of guest speaker than the majority of people that come into class.
Yeah. I mean, there's and so much of this is, I think, context dependent on the topic. Like, I think there's certain out of the box things. Like, accounting's a great example. I don't think you need a lot of like guest speakers in accounting, because like like here's how you do it. Like, this is what you're supposed to do. But you got to be purposeful with what you're doing. And again, I think there are certain classes that they just react better content wise to bringing in guest speakers. You have to be able, though, to kind of figure out what you're seeing in the process there, and what the content seems to match in terms of the people. And do you have the right people? Do you have the right people to go tap? You reach out to people out of the blue all the time. I used to reach out to people out of the blue all the time. But whatever you end up deciding on in terms of, yes, I want to bring this person into the mix, a lot of it really does come down to this idea of, well, I I would like to have this person in the mix. I don't know if they necessarily match exactly what I want to do with the class. And so even if you think you need a guest speaker, you really want to think through that process very, very carefully about, like, what is this going to add? How is this going to fit into the larger scheme of things? How am I going to test what they learned? All those things, I think, have to fit into the mix. It's not just about, oh, that person would be perfect to talk in my class, which a lot of times I feel like is the extent to which the thought process proceeds through.
I really like that idea of added value to what's the purpose. We're always going back to that why question, but it is really important. Everything that you choose to do should be intentional. You should know the why behind it and what you are adding to the conversation. Now, I will say, Galen, that I have an idea for accounting if Katie ever needs or wants a guest speaker, because one thing that I think students really value, no matter what class level it is somebody to come in and talk about how they got to where they are and what their job actually looks like on a day-to-day basis. And even though some of us as faculty, I work as a marketing consultant, I can tell them what a marketing consultant does. But hearing it from someone else and hearing a slightly different perspective can be really valuable, even if it's a 300 or 400 level class, like giving, and maybe even more so in a class where they're getting closer to graduation and actually having to decide if this is a job that they want to do and do they want to work in a large firm or a small firm. I think we probably undervalue that career piece in our classes and probably need to think more intentionally about that, because unless you have students who are really, really, really outgoing, they're not reaching out to people asking them about their job and how they do their job and how they got their job. They're needing that in our classes. So that's one area where I think guest speakers are always going to be better than me.
I could see that. And again, you have to know the extent of your expertise and how comfortable you are talking through certain areas. And to me, it's why there's not a one size fits all with a lot of these things. And I mean, it's funny because some of the best usage of guest speakers, I'll go back to the example I used with our sports broadcasting class. Like, the person I have teaching that class would be just as capable and just as effective, and maybe even more so than the people she brings in talking about those subjects. But there's another voice factor that's really important, that you can say the same thing as someone outside and students will pay attention more to that person because it's a new voice. There's the reinforcement elements, which you've already referred to. And then there's just the basic idea of like who would be the best person to provide this information or these thoughts on. And it does also allow us in this era, since we're not relying entirely on people being in person, it does you know, I've done this with a couple of classes now. Instead of doing a full guest lecture, I will interview the person on Zoom. I will hit the things I think that they can provide. I will ask students to give me questions, and I'll ask a couple of those questions. I'll record it, and then I'll send it to the students outside of class and say, "Watch this." And
Mhm.
this becomes part of what you get tested on. To me, that's the kind of added value. It's almost like a reading that they do. It's a video in this case, but that allows me to perhaps have it be additive related to the content of the class and what I'm trying to get across, rather than being a replacement for a lecture or something else that, because this is the thing. It's like a lot of times guest speakers don't need the full 75 minutes or however long you've got the class in. I mean, when was the last time you had a guest speaker and it took the whole time? And when was the last
Never.
time? Yeah. And most of the time, guest speakers done after 40 minutes, like, well, that'll be it for today. That, or we'll jump to something else that isn't the guest speaker, which confuses students a lot of times. So I would be, eh, I would consider at least the impact of what you're doing and how it's going to reconcile with what you want to do with the class overall, and what would be the best format by which to present students that.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. And thinking through, I love a good guest speaker that's recorded. And I like to use it in instances where it's something that me just in like online classes, me just lecturing about trends and marketing, not super interesting. Me interviewing somebody who is a current person working in marketing and talking about trends in marketing, much more interesting. Could we have said the exact same things, and do we usually? Absolutely.
Mhm.
But it's not going to be as engaging to hear me talk about it for 20 minutes in an online lecture.
Right.
And I think it also adds a little bit of credibility for students. And this might sound opposite in your mind, right? Bringing in an expert to talk about something that they might be more knowledgeable about than you gives you credibility, but we forget that sometimes admitting we don't know everything makes the things we do know, and they are more salient. Students trust them more because we are not pretending to be an expert in everything, because even if you know your field really well, there are still things you don't know. And there's still things you don't know as well as someone else. And so sometimes I even think guest speakers can help us as faculty be seen as more trustworthy and more knowledgeable, because we're admitting that we do not know all the things. And I found that to be something students tend to appreciate. Now, if you're going over like four guest speakers a semester in a 16-week semester, is probably the top I would ever do, unless I'm in a course that's a survey course specifically designed to say, I don't know, bring somebody from 10 different areas of college athletics to talk about their job. Like that's a completely different type of class. But I would, not do more than that in a semester, because it sometimes becomes repetitive for students. And then they're like, well, I already heard this 5 times.
Right.
I don't need to hear it again. And that goes back to you being, like you said, being very intentional about what this specific person is bringing that can add to what we already know.
Yeah, the only exception I would make normally in that circumstance is in very practically focused classes that are very industry connected, where whether it's broadcasting or writing or social media or production, what really helps students is hearing from professionals that are doing what they want to do in 5 years, 10 years, whatever, being able to ask them specific questions about things they've done. And I think maybe even more importantly, and this is probably where I think my students get the most benefit out of the guest speakers, using that as an opening for a networking opportunity for the students. And now it's like, and I always ask my guest speakers ahead of time, like, are you okay if I give out your email address? And they're always like, yeah, sure. Not every student follows up. I'd say, if I have a class of 20, I might have 3 students follow up. But the 3 students that follow up, that could be a make or break networking connection for them when they get ready to go graduate, or even if they just need somebody to give them feedback on what they're doing. And so even if it's a bit repetitive in terms of, like, the nice thing is, a lot of those experiences that you have in those sorts of professions, they're not the same. And a lot of what I'll do is we'll start them off by saying, okay, give us how did you get where you're at? because that's what everybody wants to know. Like, how did you become a play-by-play broadcaster? How did you become a social media content, expert? And so having them lay out their career path, especially honestly, especially if they're under 40, that's the kind of the magical dividing line. Because I think people that you would want to bring in as guest speakers, a lot of times you want to bring in the biggest names. I prefer to bring in people who are maybe not within touching distance of the student, but at least the student could see them on the playing field. They're not up in the skybox. They're yeah, I can see like, oh, hey, 10 years from now, that could be me if I did X, Y, and Z. That I do think has a lot of benefit to it.
And on that note, I will often bring in people who've been out for 2 or 3 years,
No, that
graduates of
absolutely.
the program for that same reason, because there are a lot of lessons that get learned, and to hear that from someone who's learned them recently is a little bit easier to relate to. And I think the other thing that is important, and this is one reason you hit on another reason why I've been using more guest speakers than I did originally, and that is we preach a ton in sports management. I'm sure in any business field and maybe in other industries as well, certainly in media, you have to network, 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 right? That's how you're going to get a job. And I think that means that it is also our job to provide opportunities for them to do so, which is what guest speakers do. Now, whether students take them or not, like you said, we can't control, but I think that's a really important reason to at least integrate a couple into not all, but most classes that you teach, because those relationships do matter for the students that end up taking advantage of them. And honestly, it's good for me too. Like I learn so much every time I have a guest speaker because they're relaying to me too what is current now in the industry, what's going on, and how are people talking about it. And that makes me a better teacher too.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have anything else to add on that. I think that's exactly right.
Okay, awesome. Well, I think we're gonna cut it there because I think we could keep talking about different examples of how we use guest speakers, but I would encourage you for at least one of your classes to try to integrate a guest speaker if you haven't in a while. Think about graduates that you've had in your program, look them up. LinkedIn is such a great tool for keeping in touch with people in your industry and former students. I love LinkedIn so much because otherwise I wouldn't know what half of my students, who I taught when I was a graduate teaching assistant at KU are doing. And reach out, look people up, see what they're up to, reconnect maybe with a former student to start because that's a, relatively easy connection to make, or look for somebody locally. If you're teaching in sports, your athletic department's a great start. People across the university also are a great start. Get them into your classes so they can see the great things your program is doing so that when you need money for something, more people have seen the great things your program are doing at the university, and start there. And think about ways that it makes sense for your class and see how it goes. Reach out if you need any help or have any questions. This is something, like I said, we're 10 episodes in, and like Galen said, you have to want to do it. So it is something that I want to do every time we meet. We have a little bit of scheduling issues always, but we make it work. So thank you again for joining us. Galen, any last thoughts before we sign off?
No, just think about what you're doing, think about who you're going to be talking with, and try to fit it into the vibe of the class. I think it's probably the last thing I'll say. If you can do all that, you're golden.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here, and we look forward to having you join us next time.